This lecture is going to look at establishing communist control. It's going to give you an overview of the different methods that the communists used to establish control. The first thing that we're going to look at is the impact of the Civil War and how that helped the communists to establish control in China. So we know that the Civil War went on between 1946 to 1949. It was a war between the nationalists and the communists in China. So it was between Chiang Kai-shek and the GMD and Mao and the People's Liberation Army. Now the communists came out victorious in 1949 and they declared the People's Republic of China. But the impact of the Civil War was pretty detrimental for the condition of China. So firstly, if we think about the manpower loss that a war will have on a country, thousands of people died during the Civil War in China. They lost a huge amount of the working population, so the people who would have been focusing on industrial and agricultural growth. And what that meant is that the industry was at 25% of pre-war levels. So it faced a decline of 3/4. Their food supply was incredibly low, and they were at 1,000% in terms of their hyperinflation rate. But what was also happening at the same time is the population was getting higher and higher. So our population was growing, but the amount of food that we had was also decreasing, and everything was getting more expensive. So at this stage, the sort of forecast for China was looking pretty low. People were pretty dissatisfied, and their standard of living was increasingly poor. But what this did do was acted as a base for the communists to come in on. The communists were able to use this to their advantage to show people that they were the better option. They would fix the situation and they would increase the standard of living for the people in China. He won the goodwill of the people, and he made it clear that he thought that building of communism was a long-term project, and many Chinese non-communists felt optimistic that a new united front could be created. People were on side. Because the communists won the war, they brought an end to the destruction that was taking place. They also issued statements which suggested that these problems of low industry, low agriculture, and hyperinflation would be dealt with by the communists. So they were able to use the Civil War to establish control by showcasing it as an opportunity for the communists to resolve the problems and get people on side. What they then had to do is establish a structure of government which would act in their favour. So in 1949, they have the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, and that happens in September 1949. Here we've got 600 delegates. It's composed mainly of the Communist Party, but it did have some of the other minority leagues. But at this conference, what is established is the Central People's Government as a supreme state body and approved the Common Programme. Now what the Common Programme was, it was the temporary constitution which would last 5 years. Okay, and that is put into place at the CPPCC. What it does is it guarantees a range of personal freedoms for the people, and that includes gender equality. It gives the army and the police the right to suppress counter-revolutionary activity. So the army are here, we can see the PLA, and they respond directly to our president. Now at this stage, our president is Mao. And Mao is giving them the permission, alongside the police force, to suppress any counter-revolutionary activity. What it did also state is that China was not ready for full socialism. But what it was going to be was a period of cooperation between the working class in order to remove any existing capitalist elements. Mao went on to speak, so Mao is our chairman, he sits here at the top of the party. He then went on to talk about the People's Democratic Dictatorship, which would be established in China. Now, the People's Democratic Dictatorship, by that, it is meant that there would be 4 classes of people who have rights in the PRC. That would be the working class, the peasantry, the urban petty bourgeoisie, and the national bourgeoisie. And he listed 5 black categories. And that was essentially everybody else. And then it stated that China would be divided into 6 provinces. So initially, China is made up of 18 provinces. That's small little states within the overall state of China. But what Mao does is that reduce that down to 6. And the aim of that is so that decisions could be taken nationally and that they would then be imposed effectively across China. There would then be regional congresses for each area, which gives us the impression that these regional local districts would be listened to. However, we'll look at in a few minutes' time how that wasn't entirely the case. He then made 4 senior communist officials in charge of each region. Okay, so those are our danvais. They are in charge of each of the regions, and there's 4 of them per region. These danvais were made up of state officials. Sometimes we also had members of the PLA who were danvai, but the PLA, as well as responding directly to the president and removing counter-revolutionaries, their role was to also ensure that the citizens were following the rules set by the Communist Party. So what this meant is Mao had high levels of central control, because ultimately everything fed back to either the president or the chairman. And in 1949, Mao held both of those positions. Fast forward to 1954, 5 years later, our temporary constitution has been established. We now have a second CPPCC. And what they do is they establish the permanent constitution of China. China becomes a permanent communist state. They create a state council, which was created by the government. The CCP retained control. Those 6 regions were now subdivided into 21 provinces. And the aim of that was to kind of distribute control, but to ensure that Mao had ultimate say over those provinces. It allowed for better control by members of the PLA and the individual danvais. The bureaucracy expands greatly. We have 720,000 state officials employed in 1949, and that goes up to 8 million in 1959. But this created some fear in Mao. What he feared was that this creation of bureaucracy, having such a large number of bureaucrats, would slow down his revolution. So this fear was pretty pertinent in Mao. What he then does is ensures that people in those high positions of power are people that he trusts. So in 1954, Zhou Enlai remains the premier. He is the prime minister. But Mao appoints Peng Dehuai as commander-in-chief for the PLA. So somebody just below him to ensure that the PLA are following his control and maintain manageable. Party membership becomes restricted in order to prevent lots and lots of voices from being aired in Parliament. Trained party members become known as cadres, and they play a key role in monitoring the civil service, legal systems, the school, and the army. So that is how Mao uses the structure of the government to maintain control. On top of that, he also issues this thing called democratic centralism. And what that allows for is the idea that whilst the Politburo, our decision-making body, would vote on ideas, the ultimate say lay with the chairman. So Mao had ultimate control over all decisions. So he could decide whether or not things would actually be passed. So democratic centralism allows for centralised power. We then have the role of the PLA. So the PLA were the People's Liberation Army, the army used in China. It started off as 5 million men in 1949. But in order to ensure that Mao was able to manage them and keep control over them, that was reduced to 3.5 million in 1953 and then 2.5 million in 1957. And that reduction essentially meant that the PLA were no longer a threat to the party. But they did play a huge role in getting the people on board. The PLA were a means for indoctrination. People were really keen to join the PLA, and 800,000 men recruited each year for 3 years to join the PLA. They were also a workforce. They acted to rebuild infrastructure and support the agriculture, and they were also a general means for enforcing government control in the regions. And we'll see how they played a role when we look at the Great Terror in a second. So the PLA are another factor in establishing control. Then we have the Great Terror. So the Great Terror launches in 1953 and it is a campaign of terror against counter-revolutionaries. It starts with this idea of a labelling system. We've got red and black labels. The red label is for people who are pro-revolution. They are safe. But black labels were given to people you should be suspicious of. They were the people who were labelled counter-revolutionaries. And it was them who would be targeted by the People's Liberation Army. And they would then be sent to re-education camps, which we'll look at a little bit more in a second. We also have these reunification campaigns. They targeted the regions of Tibet, Xinjiang and Guangdong. Now, Tibet was invaded in October 1950 by the PLA, and there was consistent effort made by the CCP to destroy Tibetan Buddhist identity, and the Han Chinese settlers were brought in to take over. In Xinjiang, it was the westernmost province of China. 80% of those were Uyghur Muslims, and a significant number of Han Chinese were moved into the area after the campaign to take over. Guangdong was the GMD heartland. The province capitulated to the PLA only 2 weeks after the declaration of the PRC. So it was taken over in order to remove any nationalist identity. We then have a crackdown on crime. Anybody who was seen a nuisance, anybody who was seen as petty criminals were targeted and removed by the PLA. And we have this thing called 3 and 5 Antis campaign, and that targeted corruption, waste and delay in government. And the idea was that it was to remove anything that was seen as counter-revolutionary and against communist values. The methods they used were accusation meetings, denunciation, humiliating confessions, and essentially shooting people dead too. So to summarise the Great Terror, it lasted until 1953, not 1951 as it says here, and people who were targeted were often sent to re-education camps. Those re-education camps were known as laogais. Within the laogais, people were to undergo thought reform. 9 out of 10 of their prisoners were political, and they brought in Soviet experts to support this movement. It's estimated that during the Great Reform, 2 million people were sent to these laogais, and several more were shot dead. It is believed that between 1949 and 1976, Mao was responsible for the death of 25 million people through the use of laogais. He also used propaganda as a huge means of gaining control. Posters like this one here were published to get people on board and encourage them to support the communist values or to be sent to laogais. We then have the 100 Flowers campaign. Now, this was launched after the process of de-Stalinization. It was a response to the fear that it instilled in Mao. He was worried that the same process would happen in China if he was seen as a harsh leader. He encouraged people to come forward and to criticize the CCP, to support them in making it better. People were initially reluctant, but Mao spoke up again in February 1957 and tried to get people on board, and eventually they did, and the criticism flooded in. We have an example here of Hu Feng, who in his diary wrote about the pitfalls of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. That was then published, and the sheer amount of criticism forced Mao in 1957 to launch the anti-rightist campaign, where he stated that anybody who criticised the communist government would be seen as an as a rightist and counter-revolutionary. Those people were then sent to Laogai, where they would undergo thought reform. They would have to confess to their sins, and a lot of these people would end up dead. So the 100 Flowers movement was essentially reversed. Finally, we have the Korean War. Now, the Korean War started in 1950 and ended in 1953. And as part of the Korean War, the people were encouraged to unite against America. And Mao launched this slogan here: resist America, aid Korea, in order to try and get people on board. And what it did was it enhanced the control at home. It increased the amount of terror. Foreigners, and in particular missionaries, were pushed out. Propaganda was designed to create national unity, as we can see in these ones here. And essentially, it kind of brought China to the focus of both the international allies and the people who were slightly concerned about the Communist Party. Eventually, China came out on top, and Mao was seen to have done an incredible job in leading the party in war against America. And their international prestige essentially increased as a result of this. However, the relations with the USSR worsened as a result of the Korean War. And on top of that, approximately 1 million men were lost at war. Mao lost his own son, and it also had a negative impact on the economic growth of the country. Those men that were lost were no longer able to work on agriculture, so food supply fell, and the industry also came to a halt. But what this loss did do is it made China's huge population more manageable as the figures went down. So the Korean War had some benefits for the Communist Party in that Mao was seen as a great leader, their international prestige increased. But on the flip side, we also had negative impacts on the industry and the agriculture. So those are just 6 ways, in which the PRC was able to establish in 1949 and how the Communist Party tried to maintain their control. So just a little recap: we had the Civil War, the structure of government, the PLA, the use of terror, the 100 Flowers campaign, and the Korean War. Next lecture we'll look at industry and agriculture.